Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of building a website and what that entails as far as client side and back end. And so this is going to play towards understanding how we need to build our class site for the next 6 weeks and kind of like what that entails and how we need to structure it and code it up. So if you think about what various types of web development or options are available when you're building a website, is there's kind of only a few options. One is basically having a static site, right? And so this is if you had an HTML document open and you coded up each piece, each element, and you saved that out, and then your server just sent that HTML document to the client every time it requested it, right? So this is very manual process. It's a very limited process, right? It's every time you make a change, you'd have to go in and update the HTML manually and then publish it again, right? So that's a static site. The next kind of step from there would be static generation. And this is kind of like you can use some tools called Jekyll, which is Ruby based, or tools called Hugo, which is Go based. And basically, this is a template generation system. So basically, you can imagine, okay, I have a directory of 100 things, and I want to use the same template over and over and over again for those 100 things, but make an individual page for each one of those 100 things, right? So I'm going to end up with 100 web pages, but I don't want to manually hand code 100 web pages by hand, right? And so I have maybe some database or some data that I want to process, and then it's going to go through this templating engine and produce all these static HTML files. So this is kind of nice if you don't want to have to run like a dynamic server that's like has a big kind of database involved and having to process requests in real time. You're basically saying, okay, I have all my data, I know all the possible permutations. I'm going to generate these static documents, these static HTML pages, and then if I'm going to make a change later, I'll simply go back, change the template, and regenerate them all again and publish all of them at once, right? So this is a very kind of low kind of low commitments, right? So you could have like a static web serving place, like an Amazon S3 bucket, or some other kind of static web serving, GitHub Git pages, and these are just serving HTML files, but you're doing all the hard work of generating those using these tools. So kind of a step up in complexity from that would be the server-side dynamic page. So what you can imagine this is that there's a program running on the server, a request comes into the server, and it says, hey, I want to look at this information for this specific item. And the dynamic server says, okay, and it looks up the information in the database, and then it builds an HTML page in real time and then serves that as an HTML page to the client, right? So there's no static HTML site anywhere. There's no kind of static HTML involved. The server is building the HTML dynamically in real time based on the information coming from the request. So this is how the vast majority of websites work. Like if you ever did like a WordPress page, right? You know that you don't create a web page for each blog post. You create a blog post template, and then the database fills in those pieces of the template with data, and then serves that as a HTML page to the client. And so there's lots of various libraries and applications that do this, like Express, which is Node, JavaScript, Django, which is Python, Ruby on Rails, PHP, on and on. There's tons of these. And then kind of this a little different take on that is a client-side framework. And so in this case, the HTML is not being generated on the server side, it's being generated on the client side. So you have these very kind of complex and elaborate JavaScript libraries like React or Vue or Svelte, and they basically, they know how to make everything on the entire page. And so basically when the web browser hits the web page, the server sends these files, these static HTML files, and then basically the server kind of lives on the client, right? It knows exactly how to make each page, and it generates those HTML based on what the person wants to do on the client side. And so these are often called like a single application page or single page applications websites. And oftentimes these will involve kind of these dynamic requests back to the server to get data, right? So just because it knows all how to render a page, right? It doesn't have to ask the server side to render the page. It is lacking all the data, right? Because it's not going to push the entire database, for example, the um, to the client. And so this is where you'll get these kind of cases where there's an API, and the API is just basically a way for the front end to talk to the back end database to get more information, right? And so you go to the one of the item 101, and it knows that, okay, I'm going to ask the database for this piece of information about this, and then I know how to populate that HTML on the client side. So while it's still talking to the backend to get data, it's not talking to the backend and say, hey, can you build me this HTML display of this information? The front end knows how to do it and it builds it. And so, of course, there's trade-offs to both of these, to the server side and client side rendering ideas. Um, for us, in the beginning here, we're going to be mostly working on the server side aspect of it. And so for our class project, we're going to be looking at using the server side dynamics to render an entire HTML page and then base off a template and then pass that page to, as an HTML file to the client, to the browser. So if we think about how we'd want to kind of display a title, for example. So say we're going to be doing our New York Times bestseller 100 or 2,000 bestseller New York Times pages. And say, for example, this was one of the titles, right? And you wanted to have a title and you just have the text there. So if you were going to make a single web page for each one of those 2,000 titles, you'd have to do this for each one, right? You'd have to make a title for each one in the HTML and put each individual title in there and then go to the next one, next one, and do that for 2,000 times, right? So of course that's not the right way we want to do it. We want to have kind of this dynamic data. And so this way you're going to be using templates for our project. And this idea of templates is not a standardized way. It's not a standardized thing like HTML is, right? This is basically a method that a group of people who are developing a tool decided how it should work, and this is the way that they implemented it and how it works for the specific tool. And so you'll see here, we're basically, instead of having the static title, we're inputting a little bit of variable, right? And so what the server-side rendering engine can do is that it comes through your HTML before it sends it out as HTML to the client and replaces all these variables with the real data from the database. So if we kind of break down the structure of this, we can see these special symbols were added here to kind of represent the variable name, right? This is basically just syntax that the server is looking for in the code before it sends the HTML page out. It just replaces these variable markups here. So again, this is not HTML markup. This is a template markup that was defined by the tool that was developed for this specific template style. But these are kind of like the way that programming works. You kind of have to learn the syntax for the specific tools that you want to use. And so in this case, these kind of parenthesis bracket things basically tell the templating engine on the server side to say like, hey, here comes something special. Parse this stuff in between these two symbols differently. And it says, okay, here's the variable that we want you to replace this template with, right? And so the backend parses this file, replaces this seamlessly, and just passes it off to the client real HTML. It doesn't pass it this kind of marked up HTML. It's real HTML. It's transformed into real HTML. So in our example, we're talking about the New York Times bestseller site. We are looking at various templates for each one of them, right? And so before, if you were dealing with static HTML sites, you just have HTML file, .html. But because we're dealing with this templating engine on the server side, we have these special template files that kind of explain to the software that's building the HTML how to operate correctly and how to build them in the way that we want it to. So in this case, we're using this EJS templating style. There's many other types of templating engines. We just happen to be using this one, and this one just happens to have that certain syntax. So in this case, we have about 4 different templates. We have a 404 page, which means not found, right? Something's not found. We have a book page, so that's like the landing page for a book. So the Divine Comedy would have a book page just about it, right? We have an index page, which is the home page. Most things, when it's the root page, is called index. And then we have a search page, which is kind of like the interface for searching the database. So kind of get an idea of what we're talking about here. If we go over to the New York Times bestseller site, we can see that this is the index page and this is the book page, and the index page is the home page, right? And so if we look at the home page, basically it's generating a random book, and then it's displaying all the data here that is available for that book. So here we have some template variables, right? Title, description, creator. And so what the server does is that it reads this file, this template, it parses it on the back end, and then sends real HTML to the client, right? So if we looked at this in a new window and we inspected one of these books, these elements, we'd see, okay, this is a div, right? And there's the title. It doesn't have those templated things in there anymore. It's just the title, right? It's just the actual data. So, if we came in here and changed the template a little bit to add something like this, and look at it again, we'd see now it renders the title, right? And so we don't need to make a page for each each type of possible home page. It's already there. It's just reusing the template and just populating with different data. And so again, on this home page, it's just basically displaying a couple of random books as like a home page feature, if you wanted to do that. And so if we look at the way this works, we see that there's a variable here, and inside of the surrounding the variable are these little symbols saying, okay, this is a variable. Make sure you understand how it works, or make sure you render the contents as a variable. So of course, you could repeat this. You could reuse the variable over and over again in different places. It's really just like a placeholder. And so it's key to know that this is not kind of traditional HTML. This is a templating engine that's specifically designed to do this specific type of operation. So for example, I have a couple other random books in here that are commented out, right? We talked about how to comment things out in HTML. So if you wanted these other titles to appear, you'd have to uncomment them, and then they would display. Similar to the book page, right? So there's not 2,000 book pages, there's one book template, and it puts all the data into it. And so you have to know what variables are there, but then you can easily kind of structure the HTML to use these templates however you want. So we're going to be using these templates to help us kind of quickly develop our sites. And they're basically just kind of like placeholders for the real data. And so basically you're going to be wanting to think about for this week, for the first week when we're doing our HTML, you're going to be thinking about how the HTML should be set up. And then you're just going to be using these templates wherever you want that piece of information to show up, right? So you probably are not going to think that this is a very good homepage or a homepage for the for the landing page, right? So you're probably going to want to say like, okay, actually, I'd really like on the homepage to display the book cover, right, of the 3 random pages or the 3 random books that are being displayed. So if we wanted to add, say, the book cover to the homepage to have 3 random book covers or however many random books you want to display on the homepage, we would need to change the code and change the template, right? And so I'm going to switch back to the homepage, the index page here, and say, okay, so we know that the cover piece of data is being displayed here, and we go over to the page, we can see how it looks, right? It's being displayed right here. Here's the cover page, right? And we could even make sure and say cover here, and go look. All right, so there's a cover. So this is just a URL to the image, right? So if we went to that page, we'd see the book cover for that specific random book that was picked for the homepage. And so what we want to do is, we don't want to just display the text of the URL to the image. We actually want to display the image, right? And so what we can do is instead of using a div element to display text, we can use the image element, right? And so image element, if we remember, has an attribute, and that attribute is going to be the URL to where it is supposed to find the image, right? So something like this, right? So we don't have we don't want to make 2,000 different URLs. We just have a template where we know the cover URL, and we're just going to replace that with the correct piece of data. So what we can do is we can just replace where we want that URL to be with the URL template variable. And so now if we look at it again, we should hopefully see the image being displayed as opposed to the text, right? And so this is the home page. It displays a random book each time. So if we refresh, there's a different uh, image. So of course, this is probably not finished, right? You'd want to format it differently, maybe make it smaller, maybe have them in a row, etc. So, but for the first part of this assignment, we're just going to think about the HTML elements that you want to have available. So yes, you definitely want to have an image element with this in it, not a div element with just the URL. So that's kind of an example of what you're going to be thinking about is just kind of like working on the HTML elements to get started of what you'll think you'll need on your 3 different pages for each project. So for the next week, you should be spending time thinking about the design of the page, right? So what elements do you want, what features do you want to be on the home page? Maybe you want an introductory paragraph about the site. Maybe you just want a nav bar. There's going to be a search page, so you probably want to put like a search input element somewhere in there, etc. Right? So this week we're just going to be focusing on this HTML aspect of the page and getting it ready for the next step, which would be adding style, adding layout, adding formatting, etc.